Hello, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Elise Halliday McQueen. I am the chair for this year's annual artist interviews. This is organized by the Services to Artists Committee. We are pleased to welcome you here for this session. All SAC sessions are free and open to the public. These sessions provide opportunities for the creative exchange of ideas. Our content will also be available online directly following the conference through April 17th of this year. If you wish to view any SAC material that you missed or maybe watch this again. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral Lenape homelands and where we currently stand. We recognize the long-standing significance of these lands for Lenape nations, past and present. Historical awareness of Indigenous exclusion and erasure is critically important, and we will continue to work to overcome the injustices committed against Indigenous populations. This year's artist interview series features the work of Elia Alba and the art collective Postcommodity. First, we are going to have our interview of Elia. Elia was born in Brooklyn to parents who immigrated from the Dominican Republic in the 1950s. She is a multidisciplinary artist whose artistic practice is concerned with the social and political complexity of race, identity, and the collective community. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Hunter College in 1994 and completed the Whitney Independent Study Program in 2001. She has exhibited throughout the United States and abroad, including at the Studio Museum in Harlem, El Museo del Barrio, Science Museum London, Smithsonian Museum of Art, National Museum of Art, the Reina Sofia, Madrid. Awards include Studio Museum of Harlem Artists in Residence Program in 1999, the Pollock Krasner Foundation Grant in 2002, Joan Mitchell Foundation Grant in 2002, and in 2008. Anonymous was a Woman Award in 2019 and Latinx Artist Fellowship in 2021. Her work is in the collections of the Smithsonian Museum of Art, El Museo del Barrio, and Lowell Art Museum. Her book, Elia Alba, The Supper Club, brings together artists, scholars, and performers of diasporic cultures through photography, food, and dialogue to examine race and culture in the United States. She was part of the curatorial team for El Museo del Barrio critically acclaimed exhibition, Estamos Bien, La Triennale 2021. She lives and works in the Bronx. Elia will be interviewed by Susanna Temkin. Susanna is a curator at El Museo del Barrio, where she has curated the currently on view exhibition, Domestic Connex, I got it, and helped organize Juan Francisco Elso por America. Temkin earned her master's and PhD degrees from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, where her research focused on modern art in the Americas with a focus on Cuba. Prior to El Museo, she served as assistant curator at America Society in New York, as well as a research and archives specialist at the Cecilia de Torres Ltd., where she assisted in co-authoring the digital catalog Raison of artist Joaquin Torres. Temkin has published essays and reviews in exhibition catalogs and magazines, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Alice Neal, People Come First, the Rutgers Art Review, Burlington Magazine, and among others. Welcome.
You first.
Me first? You first.
Okay. Go the other side.
Well,
Hi.
thank you all, for being here tonight, Friday evening. I was honored to be invited by Elia Alba. So thrilled to be talking about your art, Elia, but I just have to acknowledge our collaboration, our friendship, so I know we'll have a fun conversation, and really thrilled to be sharing the stage with Postcommodity following us. So I thought, Elia, since it was mentioned already in your bio, how your work is at El Museo del Barrio, where I'm a curator, so I thought maybe we could just start with the work that's in our collection that was actually acquired by, I think, Deborah Cullen, who's here in the audience with us. And I think maybe this is a good introduction to your practice, and then we'll go back and forward in what you've been working on before and since.
So these suits I did in 2003. As in my bio mentioned, my parents come from the Dominican Republic, but I've always found myself in between like spaces and identities. You're either to this or to that. And I think in thinking about that, I really wanted to kind of manifest that in this work. Initially, I was doing a video, so there is a video for this, but I wanted to think about what it would be to be all like these different kind of races. But also, I think just around that time, I had started knowing about like Costa paintings and these ideas of all these kinds of mixing of races. So all that stuff kind of informed this particular body of work. And so here, you see myself as...
There are 3 suits.
There are 3 different bodysuits, and you see myself here as like a quote-unquote white person, a quote-unquote black person, and then a mixed race person, which is what I consider myself to be. But, again, the idea of race is not seamless, so it kind of alludes to it being like a construction, but also something that there's some elements of fantasy in these bodysuits as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's in the title, right?
Yeah.
If I were
what is that? And then the bodysuits themselves were not meant to be worn by me. These are actually images of my body, but exaggerated and manipulated on the computer. So they were done for a man to wear. So in the video, which I do not have here, a man is trying on these female bodysuits and kind of feeling a little bit uncomfortable in all of them. Not sure if he looks right or not sure if what he has on is correct. So it's not only just playing with race, but kind of these ideas about gender and who is what, and because I've always kind of found that discussions on gender kind of mirror my own preoccupation about living in this kind of like third space all the time, where you're not either one thing or the other. So I felt like the bodysuits was a way for me to kind of express that.
I'm gonna just move us to the next, and we can always come back and forth. Is this an image of the performance?
So this is an image, and one thing I should add, around that time in 2003, I worked a lot with 2 performance artists. One was Nicolás Tomita-Esteves, and the other one was Clifford Owens. And in this one, this is Nicolás wearing the suit. It was just like a production still that I took, but I think you can get a better sense of how the suit was made. And I should mention that because a lot of my sculptural work is done through a photo transfer process. It's something that I kind of accidentally it happened. I was very much interested in, I've always been a photographer, but by accident, I was playing with materials and I left like a newspaper on top of a medium, and I realized that the inks kind of absorbed it, and I thought, well, wow, like why can't I consider now building on a photograph, making that photograph almost like 3-dimensional. And so this is kind of where these ideas, these photo transfers. So a lot of the sculptures that you're going to see here, they're all photo transfers on fabric.
I think I told Elia, I obviously we began this presentation with the work from El Museo, but really the first time that I came to know of your practice was in an exhibition at the 8th floor that Sarah Raceman, I think, put together.
Yes, she did.
And I became totally entranced with the activation of the bodysuit, because there was a video of Nicolás performing in it, and then this piece, Portrait of a Young Girl. So again, I'm always really interested in titles, so I'm curious a little bit about the title, but I think it's really interesting what you said about wanting to move into a 3rd dimension when we look at this piece, because she's completely crinkled, smushed against the wall in this case. This is you again. is this like an autobiographical piece? I mean, I think autobiography is through all your work, but can you?
It is, even when I'm not utilizing myself. But yes, this is again a bodysuit that I started to do, not necessarily knowing exactly where I was going to go with it. And again, I just kind of, sometimes I work very intuitively and not necessarily plot it all out. I think for me, it's especially with the nape, because I'm working with materials and fabrics, sometimes I feel it's important to kind of let that fabric or let that work kind of come out towards me. So in this case, just to go back to the title, Portrait of a Young Girl is a reference to Picasso's Portrait of a Young Girl, which was done during his Cubist phase. And I wanted to I was thinking about that, you know, this idea, when the whole idea of Cubism being like a breaking down of the picture plane. So here is this transfer, but I'm breaking it down more as a sculpture. And so everything is kind of inverted. So her hands are posed, so is she praying? What is she doing? But her backside is exposed to you as her feet. So there's some like a little bit of sexual tension in there. And there's a little bit of element of grotesque in it too, because you're not really quite sure what's going on with the work.
I wanted to actually, you talked about playing with the fabric, and like I've been in your studio where I see you pinning the fabric on the walls. Is that how this evolved? Were you just like manipulating, and how did you end up at this kind of, was it thinking about Cubism that you ended up with this kind
Yes, because I had made the suits still wanting to, and another point I should make, sometimes I'll start, this bodysuits, the first bodysuits I did in 2003, and I will come back to an idea again. I don't necessarily say, okay, I did it in 2003, I can't retake it again 10 or 12 years later. So this was a bodysuit that I had already pre-made. And then I started to, like I just had it on a table and I just started playing with it. You know, I was envisioning of cutting off the feet and kind of sewing that back on. But instead, it was easier for me to kind of like shrink it and put it all together. It's probably like about, I don't know, like 36 inches. So it's kind of imagining my body collapsing. And yeah, so I was kind of thinking about when, you know, like Cubist art and this kind of collapsing of the picture plane in thinking about that. And then I put on synthetic hair, so to make it even a little weirder. I like weird things.
Well, I mean, I think we should remember that when we get towards the end of your of this presentation, and we see some of the current work you're working on. It's really nice, I think, for me to see how you're shifting some of these ideas in terms of proportion, size, beings. This is a work that I wasn't so familiar with, and I know you really wanted to show. And I want to ask you about the contrast between the singular girl that we just saw, who kind of contains multitudes. Like you've already mentioned how, you know, you are interested in multiplicities of identity, but here, I mean, this is literal multitudes, a crowd, a gathering.
Yeah, it is kind of like a crowd. So this is a project that I did in 1999 when I was a resident at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I had just recently given birth when I was accepted into the program. And, you know, my mother had worked in the garment industry up until she retired. So this is kind of like my first segue into working with fabrics. And that's why I think it was important to put it in. So at that time, I was thinking a lot about the labor that we put in as mother, as wives, because I was a wife at that time as well, versus, you know, what was happening at the same time, which was this big conversation on sweatshops. It really came out within media in 1998, 1999. So for me, there was kind of like this like juxtaposition, or this kind of, I felt like something to be said about, you know, laborers that are like unappreciated, and women's work that is unappreciated, and how do these two things come together? So as you can see in the little corner picture, they're actually like baby booties. So they allude to like a mother maybe knitting some booties, but they also can look like little fantasy and fairy slippers, which kind of alludes to the fantasy, which is the fashion industry. So it's kind of merging all these like different ideas to get to this work, but they're not really, the shoe in art is kind of, it's kind of like a stand-in. And so these are a stand-in not for the wearers or the babies because they're small. These little shoes went from 1 to maybe 4 or 5 inches, but actually for the laborers and mothers who created them.
And why red?
Red has a lot to do with the body and blood, and so they're, some of the booties, some people, some of them look a little phallic, some of them look like female body parts. So it was, again, combining all that stuff together.
Yeah.
Which I never really talk about it, but if people pick up on it, then I'll say, yeah, that's it.
I just want to keep us moving. And again, I mean, this is another work dealing with multitudes that, a very time-sensitive piece. We can look at the date, and I think I should let you elaborate on, this was recently discussed since it was the 20th anniversary of September 11th.
Of September 11th. So I don't consider this piece kind of a homage. More thinking about, at the time I was reading, I probably shouldn't even be saying this, but I was reading Capitalism and Schizophrenia, 1,000 Plateaus. And that's kind of where the idea, I was starting to reread it. Mm-hmm. And there, in there, they were talking about this idea of power and sometimes how these things or these conversations on unity is really only in the service of power. It's a way to divide people. But then you have this tower which contains all the faces of all the people that perish. I think if you, the next one, of all the people that perish. It's like about 3,000 little faces. I think it was about 3,000, more or less. And I created little pillow faces, again, with the photo transfer process. I made the little pillows and stuffed them in the tower. I think, when we think about it, death is kind of like the master equalizer. There is no discussion on unity anymore. Everyone's kind of all in the same place. And when I was envisioning this, I was envisioning making really large heads. I didn't put this in this slideshow, but before I started doing this, I had done some larger heads as sculptures and put them in photographs. But with this, I realized that it was important to think about this idea of collapsing, and as sad as it was, I kind of imagined there being a collapse of bodies just piling up on top of one another.
But I think, there's something about care, right? Like you, in the previous, the red shoes, you talked about women's labor and the act of making that goes unrecognized. And to me, like there's, very intimate work when you're working with these small pillows that are someone's face and the physical labor that it took you. I imagine it must have been meditative or...
It was, and it wasn't, because I remember my son was maybe 4, and he was just so tired of seeing all those like, I couldn't go to my studio, so I had to work, I was working from home to do this, and he was just, get them out of here, and he would throw himself on that, and so yes, it was, but it was also too, like every time you saw a face, it's like, when you see a face that is not around, you have to wonder about their life, and so there is some form of care in there, and trying to preserve a history, and also this idea of unity. We were united by a very white American front. That's what kind of was the response. Meanwhile, those towers were not just filled; they were filled with many people also from Latin America and the Caribbean, which was, it got kind of lost in the conversation. And also other Muslim people that were in there as well, not just the attackers. So I was very much interested in how that was playing out.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we should move to the next slide, but this is an instance of you recognizing a community.
Yes.
I mean, a community united by all working and being in the same place, but that kind of recognition of community is, I think, really critical to what we'll continue to see in your work.
And you see it in the shoes too. It's a community of laborers and mothers. This was actually just a production still to a video that I did called La Haba, which is in the Dominican Republic a term that means high yellow. It's not complimentary, and I was told that many times growing up. So it always kind of made me feel awkward, and so in this video you have this, again, Nicolás Esteves, this was done in 2003, where I, again, created a community skirt, and it was kind of a nod to Josephine Baker. If I think all of you know, Josephine Baker, a Black American dancer, went to Paris. She was all the rage, but she danced with bananas around her hips, and the implications of that were, I think we all know what they were. So here I make literal those bananas into people of color. And so in this picture, again, this is Nicholas wearing my face, dancing around with this skirt, and he's twirling around, and it has like some kind of 60s cha-cha music, boogaloo music. I think it's funny. Probably should have bought the video instead.
I mean, I think I want to ask you a little bit about who are the people we see on the skirt. I don't think we need to know that, but I'm curious again about you bringing community together, and who, for this particular work, who's there?
For any friend that allows me to make them into a doll head or a mask, I relied a lot on my friends to let me photograph them. I couldn't randomly say, look, to a stranger, I'm doing this, can I photograph you like this? And then they're like, what? Although I have gotten that reaction.
I mean, I'm sure now everyone probably wants to be photographed by you. And can you just tell us too, I mean, this is in a way, I think, more of a composed piece than we'll see in the next few images that also use this idea of the mask. So can you tell me a little bit more about working on the studio set versus working on, some of the masks that we'll see that are...
Yeah, so with this idea, I think that was well, was it this one or the one when I did If I Were in 2003? I was making these big heads, and I introduced the mask because I wanted to just cover the person, cover the person up. But I really started to think about how the mask, especially for myself, where, when I was traveling back and forth between the DR and here, there was always some kind of, again, this in-between space I was always living in, this kind of code switching and camouflage, and just trying to be whatever it is that you wanted me to be in that particular moment. So the mask, which I was preoccupied with photographing people with masks. I did them, I think you can go to the next slide. I did them, I did them, through the city. I traveled with my family to Mexico. Everybody wanted to go on a tour bus. I hated it, but I did it anyway. And so I made them wear my mask. That's my son with the water bottle at a very young age. I cannot ask him now to do anything. But back then, it was easy. Do it. That's what your mom says.
But I love to, I mean, you kind of, in a veiled way, already brought up your mom and how she was part of the garment industry. And I know your mom has helped you create some of your work. So, I mean, your family has always been around and kind of been complicit in your art making?
Yeah, my mom, I love my mom, but my mom, I don't know, for those that have a Latina mom, they can be really intense. And my mom was certainly that. And we had our differences, but once I decided, and by the way, I wasn't 18 and said I'm going to be an artist. I was photographing a lot in my late 20s, but it's really when I turned like 30 that I said, okay, I'm going to be an artist now, you know. And they're like, what? What are you doing? And so I started to, it was just because when I started to work with fabrics, you know, I was starting to ask my Mom, how can I do this? How can I sew this? How can I put this together? And, you know, within that, she goes, well, you can do this or that. And that's how we started to collaborate. So she would help me make the masks. I would do the transfers. The bodysuits, she sewed it completely. You know, I did all the transfers on the body, but she was the one. Those booties that you saw, the way they were done was like I would make a little bag out of fabric and then mold it with my hands and then let it dry. You know, I would put a solution or something to make it dry. But she sewed all those bags.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
I'm always interested in, you know, they're not necessarily family lineages. I know she wasn't an artist, but, you know, how you kind of have observed her and knew what her skills were. And she's a collaborator, basically.
She is, and my mom, when I was, you know, we were the best dressed kids on the block because my mom always sewed, you know. She was always sewing our clothes, coats, you know, she even learned how to make hats, you know, just because that was her way. But I also think, too, a lot about how that is just kind of like I believe, a form of agency for many folks, immigrants that come here, and it's like it's a thing that they control, it's a thing that they make.
I mean, it's interesting, you actually strip your people down when you create your bodysuits, you know?
Oh, well, not really.
I want to ask you too, though. I mean, I know this is a film still, but you kind of buried the fact that you started in photography.
I always do that.
Yeah, tell us about, what's the start of you picking up the camera?
So the start of me was, in the 80s, I was a party girl. I wasn't thinking about making art. I liked to go out. And
you were being photographed.
I guess. I don't want to talk about that. I dabbled in a little bit of modeling, just a little bit. And I was always going out, and I would have my little Canon AE, was like a film camera, and I would photograph a lot of people. Unfortunately, a lot of those photographs are gone because I know I had people like Basquiat, I had people like Keith Haring, because we were all around the same generation, and you know, I was just photographing these people because they looked like they were fun, you know. And lots of other characters of 80s nightlife. But then there was this woman at the time called Martha Swoop, and she was the premier photographer. It's like the one that everyone went to photograph all the theater and all opera performances, etc. And I'm like, I want that job. So I decided to reach out to smaller companies and started photographing those sets, which I think really helped me when I was into, you know, fast forward into 2015 with the Supper Club. But it wasn't satisfying enough to just be documenting these things, even though I had a lot of fun with it. And it's great when you're with actors because they're so dramatic and they'll just give you what you want. So then that's when I kind of stopped after that. I stopped for a while and started going into more sculptural practices, and then merging photography with this, through photo transfers into sculpture, and then, you know, coming back to photography and doing masks of people, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
constant layers of stuff.
Yeah, I kind of fast forward over some of the slides, and we can certainly go back, but I wanted, since you're talking about being a club kid and how that influenced your practice, I wanted us to maybe talk about Larry Levain.
Yeah, Levain.
Levain. Cookies.
Levain. He was vain.
So yeah, tell us, I mean, who is Larry for those who don't know, and why did you want to, you know, recast him?
So Larry Levain was a DJ who started off in the 70s in the Continental bathhouses, not that I went there, but I couldn't go there even if I wanted to. It was predominantly a bathhouse in the 70s, and I think I was a little too young. But he then this person named Mel Charon. This was, of course, around the time of late disco, and he owned West End Records, and he actually started this club called Paradise Garage, where Larry Levan was the head DJ. I think he was just a resident DJ there. And he was there from like the late 70s to like the late 80s, and I went during the 80s. And, you know, it started off as a gay club, but then they kind of started to let women in. Of course, this was a time where you didn't need ID and you could be...
But it was a special space.
It was a
special ambiance.
It was a very special ambiance. Larry Levan was, I think, the first DJ to really look at DJ as not a thing about placing records, but thinking about moods and how people feel, and grabbing onto what he was seeing in the audience of the people that was there. I mean, every time I went to Paradise Garage, no one was sitting, you know, everyone was dancing. He was almost like a shaman. And he also, you know, he made machines that is kind of what we see now in current DJs. He introduced the dub aesthetic. I think he's if you speak to any DJ, they're gonna know exactly who this person is, because he's like the godfather, maybe the grandfather of all this, of grandfather of DJs. So for me, it was, the way this project happened was my friend and curator, Edwin Ramoran, we were talking about disco and the importance of disco, which unfortunately disco has become this, or became this kind of like plastic parody, you know, and Studio 54, right? It got incredibly whitewashed when it was actually something that started in black and brown environments. Not to say that there weren't white DJs, but that's really where it started. And so in that conversation, that's where in discussing Larry Levan and that time period, I wanted to do a series of photographs where, you know, dancer and the DJ are one. So people are dancing to the remixes, and I photographed them. I mean, I had to, you know, it was a fun night. We got everyone a little tipsy, and I snapped away.
I didn't even realize it was a singular night. I always thought of this as...
It was actually 2 nights in a club that doesn't exist, but was 2 doors down from where I live now.
Full circle.
Full circle. Want to go back to the...
Sure. Here?
Yeah, go back one more. These are, again, with the masks, these are, again, like photo transfers. We're going to be 2009. Yeah, the Larry Levan was in 06. Talking about full circle and coming back to works that I'd done in the past. This is kind of like, this is something I was always envisioning right after I did the.
We're good.
We're good? Okay. Right after I did the suits, but I didn't get to do it until like about 6 years later. And this was shown at the Havana Biennale. You could go to the next one. And so here, these are masks that are like kind of masked torsos. They're actually the same size as the people that you see here. And so they can be, you know, but another person can wear it too.
I mean, have they ever been worn? I mean, maybe that's a way we should get into like the performative aspect of your work. I mean, we talked about it with the videos and Nicolas, but like...
No, these have not been worn. They were done, and they were done to kind of replicate, to be like kind of like, not African masks, but kind of lucha libre. I don't know how to say that in
Wrestler.
Wrestler, yeah. Wrestler.
I mean,
but wrestler and lucha libre are 2 different things.
Yeah. But let's talk about, I mean, I'm curious. When we were chatting, we were going to talk about portraiture, which I know we'll get to with the Subret Club. But I mean, costuming versus masks versus bodysuits. Do you want to talk about those nuances that you see in these practices? Because
Well, there are things that are kind of, that you think they can be performed, but not necessarily performed. So you do have a sense that there's some performance element in the work. With the suits, that was definitely the intention with them. With these masks, no. I mean, the way these masks came about was, you know, the Metropolitan Museum has a Greek wing of busts, classical busts, which I find, again, fascinating when I think about, okay, these people are not around, what would their lives were. But what's interesting, like when you turn the corner, there's like the African wing. I've always found it very interesting, this juxtaposition of this classical like sculpture with this African way of representation. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to kind of look at that and think about doing that in both ways. And when you think of like non-Western sculptures, especially those in particular, what you'll find is the shape remains the same. What changes is the inscription or the insignia. Maybe, you know, there's one perfect example of that from the Dogon tribe. It's two figures that look exactly the same, but when you go to the back, you'll see one is carrying that looks like a little spear, the other one is a little head in a sack, which implies a child. And so I thought, when I was doing this, thinking about merging these two ideas into one. And again, it's kind of going back to that doll, that what I consider the doll portrait mm-hmm. of a young girl, mm-hmm. this kind of collapsing of a photograph, yeah. and making it into a 3D and then kind of reconstructing it all over again.
Well then, I mean, maybe we should talk about also sources, because so far you've mentioned, I mean, the Met, Cubism, Greek art, African art, we've talked about disco.
It's a long, yeah. The whole
yeah, no, club culture. And so, I mean, some of this, I think, eventually comes together in the Supper Club and the portraits that are the result of the Supper Club. But I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself because the Supper Club is really about a conversation and about a community, and the portraits are.
I mean, I think the ideas or the conversations live on in these archetypes I create through mm-hmm. the portraits. So the Supper Club was a project I started in 2012, and it was initially just going to be, I was going to create the zine, because around that time I felt there wasn't enough representation of Black and Latinos in just like regular media of, you know, Vogue, Vanity Fair. I'll admit I like those magazines. But so I said I'm going to make my own zine. But in the process of doing that and photographing folks, I realized that I wanted to contextualize them with their, with their thoughts and their ideas. And so I created 3 dinners. That was what it was going to be. I was going to do 3 dinners where everyone was in conversation. So the zine was going to have all these fabulous pictures and these 3 conversations, kind of like when you open up a Vanity Fair where they have artists like witty bantering. Well, there was no witty banter in these first 3 dinners. It was actually really intense, and the ideas of race and, you know, who gets to, you know, the idea that some people feel like some people, folks like myself, can take it on and off, where some people can't. It became about agency. It was hosted then by a friend and performance artist, Wanda Raimundo Ortiz. I don't know if she's in the audience right now. Where is she? Where's she at? Hey, right, there you go. And if you know her work and you know her character, Chuleta, she's some bossy blank from the Bronx who likes to talk to you about art. So I felt I couldn't pose the questions to the folks at these dinners.
Can we give an example of like what one of the themes for the dinners were? Because they're...
Well, these first 3 dinners were on identity and agency. Agency within the art world and you know, identity. How do you identify? Mm-hmm. and what do you do to accommodate, you know, because there's always this discussion amongst artists that we have to kind of, even with some curators, to how much do we compromise of our own integrity to get where we want to go, right? So that too was part of the conversation.
So, I mean, at what point, like you said, this was going to be a zine, 3 dinners.
Well, these dinners with Wanda changed the game for me when it came to dinners. I felt, you know what, it's not going to be enough to really unpack the things that were being said in 3 dinners, because that's how it evolved into being this thing about conversations, where then, you know, after 2014, we switched from it being about agency and identity and started to deal with real political issues, and partly because, you know, BLM was starting, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, all this stuff was happening. We had a black president, and there was just a lot of things that were not connecting, and I think folks really wanted to have these discussions, wanted to have a safe space, because that's what the Supper Club became then, this kind of safe space for people to just say what they're going to say without being chastised or finger pointed or whatever. So I did 3 dinners with Recess Art, and then I did some dinners on my own, and then the Rubin Foundation, or the 8th floor, Sarah Reisman was working there, and she really liked the project and said, you want to continue it here. So I became kind of like a resident with them for about 3 years. And in total, I hosted about 40 dinners.
And I want to just, for those of you, I mean, the book is wonderful, but it contains some of the portraits that we'll get to right now, but it also contains transcripts from the dinners themselves. So it's like this pastiche of the voices, and then, as you said, you created these avatars of sorts for...
Avatars, archetypes, you know, I don't know, like someone said they're icons. I don't know, like maybe they could be icons, you know, however you want to see it. But they represent, the idea behind the photographs was to capture the artist in a way that's reflective of their practice, at least the way I saw it, you know. And the photographs were definitely a collaboration. Nobody was forced to do something they didn't want to do. So I would have discussions. I had many discussions, and some people were keen on what I wanted to do, and some people were not, and we would like revisit until we got to the place where people felt comfortable with what I was going to do. So, you know, these images are kind of like a combination of a person's, you know, persona and their art practice. And so they're kind of, yeah, I guess they are kind of like avatars or archetypes for their practice, or what their practice is putting out into the world.
Mm-hmm. And like, oh, go ahead.
No, and they all have like monikers. This one is the Orisha, Juana Valdez. I know I saw her walk in here. This is Sean Leonardo, the hero. That was photographed at the Brooklyn Museum.
And I mean, this gets back to, as you're saying, like some of your photographic origins, right? Now you're creating the sets. I'm creating the tableaus. Yeah.
This is Lorraine.
And let's talk about, I mean, Lorraine, let's talk about the kind of this community, your community, but there's a wide range of generations that we're seeing, people from different, you know, parts of the art world, performance artists, painters. I mean, this Supper Club is really bringing together a relatively diverse group. I'm curious about how your selection process went, you know?
Well, I went to my friends or people that I knew first, and because I wanted to make sure they were comfortable with me. I didn't really ask artists that I didn't know that well. I mean, that was it. You know, not everyone.
But I think only you, I mean, very few people would be able to convene this group. I think, you know, getting to know you, you're like a convener of community, of like a very special, very intersectional, you overlap, you talk about overlaps between communities, you make people talk to each other sometimes that don't want to.
Well, never underestimate the power of food and wine, you know?
I think it goes beyond that.
No, but see, I think it does. I mean, I think about my mom, you know, my mom and dad came here. They didn't go to restaurants, you know, but there was always a party. Oh, she lost a tooth, a party. Oh, you know, a confirmation or whatever, a party. Oh, it's your dad's, you know, there was always a gathering in my house. And I remember the conversations were always around these kinds of things, you know.
Well, and we're being told that we need to wrap up so that all of you can start to ask Elia questions, but I just want to acknowledge, I mean, that ability to talk to like cross generations, to also, I think, serve as a mentor or like a generator of lineages. I just want to acknowledge how essential you were as the co-curator of Estamos Bien. But I really, I'm going to quickly go back to one of your hands.
Just one of the hands even there.
And then I want to get to the dolls, but I want to just talk about,
We'll
again.
flash the dolls, but we'll talk the hands because this is in keeping with right now what I'm doing. This is my current, what I'm working on now, is creating like again, portraits of people, but through their hands. And Mira might recognize these hands. This is a friend, a mutual friend, Ivan Monforte. Creating this portrait, and my idea is to make going back to that Greek holobus, like a big room full of hands where these like people's particular histories, especially people of color, are manifesting through their hands.
Mm-hmm. I know you want to end on the hands, but I want to end on the dolls.
She wants to end on the dolls.
Because I just really, I think they really bring together so much of what we've seen, but like, I mean, who are the dolls you, Elia?
The dolls are all me. I do play with dolls. I even collect brat dolls. With the dolls, you know, I've been making dolls since
and
like
maybe dolls is not the right word.
No, dolls is the right word. I've been making them since 2010. I know people that do dolls don't like them to be called dolls, but they actually are. You know, they're like 24 inches. They're not big. The dolls really, again, I read a lot, and there's always like particular histories. I'm reading a lot now about like pre-colonial histories and imagining what those people would look like. So here are like the DDs, you know, they have like this big red hair. I remember seeing a photograph from Albert Watson of these Nigerian women with these big, you know, their hair really teased out, and they weren't flapping or falling like this. So the dolls, you know, if we think about dolls as kind of a manifestation of, you know, not the community, but like society at large, I think, and dolls can be very educational and not always in a good way. So for me, it's like kind of bringing the idea of these like multitude of stories, like where they kind of look like they belong all together, but where are they from? What are you trying to tell me? You know, like the Nomo here is,
fantasy element.
there's a lot of fantasy elements about the Nomo were a group of aliens that came down and into Earth and gave the Dogon people the knowledge of astronomy. And the way I came to that was through a found footage on YouTube of these two anthropologists that were very, how do you say, like they couldn't understand how this tribe knew about the galaxies, stars, and the universe without having a telescope. So I'm interested with the dolls and bringing all these like kind of unresolved or hidden histories.
Mythologies.
And mythologies.
Yeah.
The end.
Excellent. I know. Thank you, Elia. This is, I mean, always so fun. I want to invite anyone who wants to ask Elia a question. There's a microphone at the center of the room. Otherwise, we can keep chatting about the dolls and their unruliness. I always imagine them like, you know, when you turn your studio lights out, what they're doing in there.
It's like a Toy Story.
It's
more than
more
that.
interesting
I know.
than a Toy Story.
But those things kind of creep in too, you know?
Totally.
Questions? I think you have to go to the mic. Or raise your hand and they'll bring the mic. I don't know. Oh, someone's coming over.
I wanted to start with thanking you for the beautiful interview and the beautiful work.
Thank you.
My question isn't so much for the work because it takes time to absorb, to kind of think of something verbal to ask about the work, but it's more about that role of artist curator. And although I appreciate curators that aren't artists, I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts about the difference between an artist curator and a curator that's not an artist.
And, ooh, oh. Well, as a curator and working with Susanna and Rodrigo, I was thinking a lot, pretty much how I did the supper club, which was, these conversations were never random. It was strategic on who you brought in together and how that was going to fit to get the conversation that I wanted. And I think that curation kind of works the same, how kind of you can fit those pieces so you have like a nice cohesive story, even if it's like something like a triennial. But as far as like the difference, I can't speak to the people that are not artists and are curators. Like, I don't even know. I think I would probably always want to approach it like a work of art.
And I also want to just add that you have now, beyond the triennial, you've curated, but now you're also teaching. And so I think that's also something relatively new, but it's an extension of your kind of building. I like that you said it's an extension of the supper club. It's like an extension of, not just your practice, but kind of you're a builder of communities.
Yeah, I think even because the class that I'm doing at NYU is more of a seminar, so it is these kind of dialogue with the students, where we read materials and then we kind of like unpack them, which is what I did with the supper club. I would always like pose a question or send something to read or just mention something out in the world and what did you think,
Thank you for the talk. A lot of the things that you're talking about, to me, I keep thinking Frankenstein. And when I say that, I mean it as like you're creating something where maybe there wasn't something, and where things touch and how they touch seems very important. And maybe even trying to create a reality that you want to happen, or for us to look at differently. I just wonder if you could speak about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, it is kind of Frankenstein-ish. When those body shoots were shown for the first time, I think there was a sign out there. Rocio, you remember that? There was a sign, yeah, because there is an element of the grotesque in them. But I think that stems a lot from myself living kind of in this in-between space. And so I'm very much interested in what's happening there in the middle. So as an artist, I love history and I love referencing history, but I like to kind of take that and then bring it together and create a new, kind of a new idea, a new
Yeah, like
history.
a new life. I mean it even in the people you bring together, like the different communities, even the way that you curate shows. It feels like you're trying to give life to something. I don't mean it as the monster, I mean it as the life. And so there's an element of the Frankenstein for me that I mean as life-giving, not freakish.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a lot too having to do with a feeling of invisibility at times as well, because I think, we live in a society that's always like either or, this or that. And, we're actually, humanity lives in gray. And I think we kind of always overlook that. So I'm really interested in those gray areas. And yes, giving life more to those spaces that don't have as much life.
Is there time for one more question? I wanted to ask about the current hand portraits that you're doing, and if you see those as connected in any way to the photo transfers on fabric, or kind of this idea of touch with the soft sculptures.
They are made also through a photo transfer process. It's the same thing, but now I'm like, quote unquote, painting on them too. Even though I don't consider myself a painter, because the way the hands work is that kind of the same thing, the portraits that I did for the Supper Club, where it was a collaboration with the person whose hand that I'm photographing. So, and I don't do random folks. I really feel like I need to have a conversation with you, and it's not like, let's Zoom and let's talk about this and then we're gonna do a hand. It's normally people that I've been interacting with and conversations that we have to kind of build on the portrait through the hands. And then, of course, there is the interconnectivity that you have of all these hands. When you see them all together, then you feel like there's a connection, like what are they trying to say? But then they're also encased. Now I'm encasing them. So it's this also too of like kind of like a preservation, also elevating again these histories, preserving them when they're not really preserved, because it's going back to living in this kind of gray area, but it kind of holding it in.
But I think the gestures are so important that you...
Some of the gestures, like this is kind of, it's kind of, some people think it's like gang sign. There is a little bit of element of that. It's not full on gang sign, I'm not gonna do that. But there's something to be said about people doing these signs. It's again, this kind of, it connects to people, whatever it is that they're doing. I'm not justifying that, but you know, the idea of gangs or the idea of people coming together is to find an alleged safe space. And so sometimes the gestures are just the way the hands are. Like Ivan's hands are so beautiful, like even in person. So these are actually really, really big. So they're kind of like reaching to the sky and saying, look at me, you know? So I mean, it depends with each person. A lot of the personality of the sitter is thrown into those portrait hands.
I think that might be a good place to wrap up. So thank you all. It's Elia, always amazing.
Thank you so much. We're going to have a break for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and hear from Postcommodity. You are invited. Okay, welcome back. We are here now for an interview with Postcommodity. Postcommodity is an interdisciplinary art collective comprised of Cristobal Martinez, Mestizo, and Cade L. Twist, Cherokee. Postcommodity's art functions as a shared indigenous lens and voice to engage the assaultive manifestations of the global market in its supporting institutions, public perceptions, beliefs, and individual actions that comprise the ever-expanding multinational, multiracial, and multi-ethnic colonizing force that is defining the 21st century through ever-increasing velocities and complex forms of violence. Postcommodity works to forge new metaphors capable of rationalizing our shared experiences with this increasingly challenging contemporary environment, promote a constructive discourse that challenges the social, political, and economic processes that are destabilizing communities and geographies, and connect indigenous narratives of cultural self-determination with the broader public sphere. Postcommodity are the recipients of grants from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, Creative Capital, Art Matters, Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, Ford Foundation Art of Change Fellowship, Harker Fund of the San Francisco Foundation, Native Arts and Cultures Foundation Shift Award, and Hewlett 50 Arts Commissions. The collective has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including at Contour, 5th Biennial of the Moving Image, Mechelin, Belgium, Nuit Blanche, Toronto, Adelaide International 2012 in Adelaide, Australia, 18th Biennale of Sydney, Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, 2017 Whitney Biennial, Art in General, New York, Documenta 14, 57th Carnegie International, Pittsburgh, Desert X in Coachella Valley, California, Art Institute of Chicago, LAX Art in Los Angeles, Minneapolis Institute of Art, Ramai Modern Museum, there in Canada. Their historic land art installation, Repellent Fence, occurred at the U.S.-Mexico border near Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, Mexico. The collective was awarded the fine prize from Smoke and Tangled Waters. They carried fire home, commissioned for the 57th Carnegie International. Postcommodity acknowledges the important contributions of its previous collaborators, Stephen Yazzie, Nathan Young, Raven Chakan, Adam Ingram Goebel, Andrew McCord. If history moves at the speed of its weapons, then the shape of the arrow is changing and promoting a more just, verdant, and harmonious resolution. Annabelle Wong, Dead River, and Existence AD, Dead River. Postcommodity will be interviewed by Elise Chagas. Elise is a PhD candidate at Princeton. In 2021 through 2022, she was the Mellon Marin Consortium Fellow in the Department of Drawings and Prints at MoMA.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the folks at CAA, especially Mira Friedlander, for organizing the event. I also want to acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded Lenape territory, and to mark that while New York is the site of ongoing conflicts, contradictions, and migrations that stem from its settlement, Indigenous people from across the Americas call the city home. Cristobal and Cade, thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation this evening. It's an honor, and it's so lovely for us to be able to continue a dialogue that began in 2020 when I had the great privilege of contributing to the catalog accompanying your major exhibition, Time Holds All the Answers at Rummy Modern. That said, my first physical encounter with your work was in 2018. I don't know if I told you guys this. I think I did the first time we spoke, but I was in the Princeton University Art Library,
yeah.
and I had been in there all day, and I exited the stairwell, and there's a large window that looks onto the adjacent Princeton University Art Museum lawn, and there was a huge balloon, like a yellow balloon, that had just sprung up since I had entered the library. It bore a symbol that looked like an eye, and it was just emanating this engrossing, cryptic energy that was sort of sinister, but I was also is it protecting us? I don't know. And so, what I had encountered was a component of your installation, repellent fence, though the term installation hardly captures what was actually an incredibly ambitious and complex logistical diplomatic project. So I'd love if you guys would start us off by chatting about that project.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this was what first piece that we really organized Postcommodity around this piece. This was the first idea on the table and was really our priority number one. And we were incredibly naive. At that time, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. We just imagined this being a guerrilla type of effort. And then we found out it took about 8 years of work, to realize it for, 4 days of being up. But we learned a lot about who we were as a collective, who we are as humans, our values and things like that, and the values of the collective first and foremost, I think. It was just a tremendous piece, but it started with a really small idea and a riff. If you could just go back to the other one, is this bird repellent product. It's I was sitting in my ex-wife's backyard at the time with Steve and Yazzie. We're drinking beers, relaxing by the pool, and there was a fig tree there, and it was bird party every day in that fig tree, and she bought one of those, put it up there. Her name's Andrea Hanley, sorry, and it was covered in bird shit within 2 days. And that's what we were looking at when we came up with the idea was, embedded obsolescence, failure. But the thing that's really interesting about it is as an object, it contained, Indian medicine colors. It contained this iconography that's used throughout the hemisphere that, brings up the idea of long-term trade north and south, because this is an iconography that's utilized all the way from the ice in Canada down to the ice in South America, so and places in between. So it was an opportunity to think about indigenous trade and our interconnectedness in the hemisphere. And discussions over 8 years, the piece evolved from this really naive guerrilla stunt to a more mature, I think, epic work that bisects this border. There's two people I want to acknowledge after you, but I want you to give you space to talk. Yeah.
All right. So just real quick, if any of you are unfamiliar with this piece, it's what we refer to as an ephemeral monument. It's a 2-mile-long land art sculpture that intersects the U.S.-Mexico border. And as Cade was sharing with you, it's it's the manifestation of 8 years of binational trans-border diplomacy that involved conversations with over 40 NGOs, with local churches, grassroots movements, the Mexican Consulate General, and it was installed near the cities of Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, which is basically a singular city that over time has been bisected by an iron wall. And so one of the things that made this a viable diplomatic endeavor is we had the chance to, we serendipitously came across a community that had a pre-existing memorandum of understanding, and that they put this MOU together to remember themselves, to avoid the amnesia that this border was creating, and that they would collaborate with one another. And so to wrap it up here, what Repellent Fence brought was an opportunity to, in many ways, operationalize the MOU.
And, you know, we just continuing that MOU discussion. One of the things about MOUs among border communities, usually there's a memorandum of understanding that's focusing on public safety around border crossing issues. And this was the first committee we came around to that had an MOU that looked at larger social policy goals. And we felt that that was really extraordinary. But we wouldn't have even, you know, it's funny, I went to school with a dear friend, Janae Sanchez, and got to know her and her husband, Roberto Uribe, and you know, they live in Douglas. Janae is from Douglas, born and raised, and she is the one who invited us to come down and visit, you know, Douglas and Agua Prieta and spend time down there. And we were like pushing away at first until we got our feet wet, and then we went right there and begged her for forgiveness, and ended up working with her and her husband. They owned together a cafe in that city, and had purchased a building downtown Douglas. And what they were is the unofficial mayors of that city, because everybody would have an important conversation about politics, about development, about the border. They would be sitting in their cafe, drinking and enjoying themselves. So that became the de facto meeting space and really ground zero for a lot of the planning and organizing efforts. But we really brought this piece in through the networks of Janae and Roberto. And just to give you an example of how strong their relationships were in the community, Roberto ended up being mayor of Douglas, you know, shortly after this artwork was completed. So we were working with really great people in that town. And I just wanted to acknowledge them before we got on, because just so important to this project.
Yeah, I feel like you guys have a real way of like navigating, finding systems underneath the usual protocols and instruments, let's say, of like, I mean, this is a border town, right? And as you're describing, through the relationships that you could build in this community, you were able to kind of subvert the enormous like political state apparatus that ostensibly administers movement in this place, right?
Yeah, we made them our partners, and they ended up being the stewards of the work.
Right.
And that really flips the script on what it means to, what education can do or literacies can do, and especially when you start thinking about them as tools in order to do things. Like, for example, we had to move hundreds of cubic feet of helium into Mexico, and which is a hazmat material, and it would have made the project cost prohibitive if they imported the hazmat through a port of entry that's certified for that kind of passage. But we had citizen groups on the ground learning transborder and border law, and they were able to find loopholes in order to make it possible for us to move the helium through at the Douglas Agua Prieta port of entry.
Right.
So it now starts to change, you know, people who feel like they're, with narratives where they describe themselves as being under the thumb of their governments, they're now leveraging the agencies that they felt had been working against them in order to do things they wanted to do in their community.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
I think our biggest takeaway from the project, Roberto Bedoya, I called it, he coined this term, he'd been working on this term for a number of years, and he spoke at a convening we had to celebrate the repellent fence. He said the phrase sovereignty of context. And what he means by that, and I'll embellish a little bit, is when you can align multiple layers of contexts that are driven or organized or sustained by this spirit of community self-determination. You know, when you can align those contexts, they take on a sovereignty in and of themselves. That, and what we found was with this project, we could suspend federal law, we could suspend federal law both sides of the, you know, in Mexico and the United States, state law and city law to realize a peace. That's not an easy task to do. It rarely ends up well, and usually end up in handcuffs, you know. So it was something, you know, really nuanced and beautiful and quite extraordinary, especially, you know, working with governmental decision makers. I worked in public policy for almost 20 years before I became a professor at Otis College, and I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And so Roberto, that was an insight that he had into this piece. Was any context you could apply to the project, that context was grounded in a social goal that was shared. And each context was working to make that project a reality. And at the end of the day, all we were doing is facilitating.
Just a catalyst.
And then even when it came to the end, we weren't even facilitating. When we were installing that work, the two cities took it over.
And they assigned,
they took the project over.
And they assigned the project its meaning.
Yeah.
Which for them was suturing the Americas together again.
Yeah, because we were still thinking in different ways about what this was. And it's an incredibly powerful experience when meaning is made and you're served that meaning with a directive. And then the directive is taking care of all those nefarious political and public safety issues that come across in that space. And where the piece was eventually sited, it was sited in a traffic zone, and the public safety was provided by a cartel for this work.
Wow.
We had no security, we had no contracts, we had nothing but handshakes and personal agreements for a number of years, which led this to happen.
We developed, and I know we got to move on. We could spend the whole day talking about this, but we entered into well over a dozen multilingual international agreements, all using, oral traditions, and not a single one of those agreements failed. That is something that I think we're really proud of.
And there's a pragmatic reason. We couldn't insure it. So because we couldn't insure it, we couldn't have contracts.
Yep.
But
I mean, I feel like this leads into
so there's kind of a funny thing.
move us
Yeah.
towards the point of final collapse. I feel like this, brings us to another key post-commodity term. You guys have, a real lexicon and idiosyncratic vocabulary, right? And so I wanted to invite you to talk about this work in San Francisco in 2019 and to talk a bit about hacking, which I feel like does pick up on what you were talking about, a little bit of subverting all of these, the red tapes, the maneuvers that, but also technologies, right?
Yeah, we definitely fashion ourselves as hackers, and we see ourselves as a virus. And we're always hoping that our DNA, or the DNA that we're encoding, that they proliferate into systems and hopefully have some impact on the transformation of systems. And this particular work, what you're looking at here, is a tower in downtown San Francisco called the Millennium Tower. It's one of the most expensive, some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And it was brought to structural completion in 2016, initiated at the height of the 2008 housing market crisis. At the time of its completion, it had already sunk 6 inches. It was engineered with a tolerance to sink maybe up to 3 inches. Today, it's sunk more than 18 inches and leans over a foot. Over 15 inches to one side. It continues to sink. And what we're doing is we are taking the data of the sinking and tilting Millennium Tower, and we are using that data to drive a generative sound art piece that is essentially, it's a data sonification of the sinking and tilting Millennium Tower. And the data sonification is projected onto San Francisco, particularly North Beach, with this image, using long-range acoustic devices, which are these they're like sonic ray guns that militaries and militarized police forces use around the world to essentially prevent people from public assembly.
Right, to disperse crowds, right?
Yeah.
And wasn't there a funny story about how you came by this piece of equipment? Is that?
Yeah, we bought it on eBay.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not regulated. It's expensive, but unregulated. So you can get it off the secondary markets. You don't need any permitting or training required. And it's developed, and the intention of it was to communicate across vast distances. I don't know if y'all remember the Somali pirates who just sunk a U.S. battleship. This is the result of that. That was to communicate at a safe distance. If you keep coming towards us, we will sink you. We didn't have that capacity back then. That was used as an excuse. So this was seen as a safety mechanism. That's how it was branded and brought in to, the public, into the world. But as Cristobal said, it has been used as a sonic weapon to disperse crowds, to prevent community organizing, and also it can be wielded to do damage to your ears. It'll drop you to your knees, make you cover your ears, and turn away from it, and that's not going to help. It's a hyperdirectional technology, so it's using very super high frequencies to carry the sonic information. Your body becomes the resonator of it. So one of the interesting aspects of the speaker is it's like having a voice whisper into your ears, and you don't know where that voice is coming
inside
from.
your head.
Yeah, so that's because your body becomes a resonator rather than the speaker. So traditionally speaking, it's really a fascinating technology and a really fascinating tool. And it's wonderful to use something that was intended for a weapon. In this case, you know, what we're sonifying is ASMR, an ASMR track. So that's what all these neoliberal types use to calm themselves for working too hard and living in a place they can't afford and trying to keep up as a consumer with the greatest consumers in the world. And so they can calm themselves for a little bit with the ASMR. So we did this, and it goes off at 5 o'clock, like 5:01, the first minute of happy hour.
Medicine.
Back well.
Yeah. Oh, we're back.
Yeah, we're back.
And so what's happening is that as the building sinks and tilts further, we get a higher density of all these sounds playing at once. So whereas over time it gets more and more cacophonous, and it becomes more and more like the sound of noise as opposed to the sound of, you know, this therapy.
Though again, it's ephemeral, right? It's only for a certain amount of time.
4 minutes every,
That's right.
yeah,
Okay,
4 minutes
every
at 5
day.
p.m.
let's see if we can cue it up. Okay. There it is.
The sample is a few minutes, but you'll definitely hear the humpback whale, some ASMR sorcery, lots of positive affirmations.
It's like nailed, right?
Yeah.
See, that's the thing I like so much
It's the soundtrack
about
of
you,
neoliberalism.
that you always seem to know, right?
Dolphin sounds. Yeah. That's the humpback whale.
You will continue to get better. You will continue to get better. You will. Doing something you don't want to do may seem hard now, but it will become easier and easier over time. Or doing something you don't want to do lately may seem hard now, but it will become
Bored.
Well, I wanted to make sure, we had talked about wanting to make sure to speak a little bit about the projects, the commissions for Reme Modern that you've all worked on in the last 2 years, right? That was a major exhibition curated by the Venerable Gerald McMaster in Saskatchewan. So this would move our conversation to projects within and for arts institutions. But again, kind of the museum threshold is this porous border in your work. So I wondered if you would talk about this work and how it troubles or even dispenses with notions of inside and outside.
Oh, that's hilarious, because that's what the mid-century modern architecture is supposed to be.
Right, so will you tell us like what this form is?
This is the zigzag or butterfly design of for a Wexler designed home. In the mid-50s, a number of architects were commissioned to design homes that were that you could create it as an economy of scale around. That was the number one challenge, is let's create an economy of scale. Let's create interchangeability, modularity. Let's make a small, tight space that is repeated over and over and over again. Let's make those spaces appear unique or interesting. Let's have lots of light, and let's blur the boundaries between outside and in. A lot of these ideals were really to compartmentalize this idea of post-World War II great generation Americana, as well as other things. I'm not an architectural scholar, so you'll have to forgive my, poor talk about that. But what we really wanted to accomplish with this piece is to acknowledge that the mid-century modern architecture that emerged from Wexler and the other architects that were commissioned to come up with a piece. Wexler is working with U.S. Steel, and he was working with steel as a material and wanting that to be used. But his concerns about material, about formation, modularity, and things like that. But what was happening is for population. The post-World War II suburban development, Southern California, in the desert Southwest, is you have the topsoil of this very fragile desert ecosystem being scraped off, and you have these suburban housing developments and pre-planned communities and everything that goes along with it. All of that was built, and people complain a lot about strip malls and wide streets and, these kinds of repetition of mass-produced housing. But that was the lubrication, the visual lubrication, the conceptual lubrication, was that it came from high design. So high design became a point of leverage to open the hearts of the Americans to flock to the suburbs. And you know, one of the areas where this was developed was Palm Springs. And Palm Springs is a contested space. That's tribal land. There's the Agua Caliente Reservation is there. The whole city is built on it. It's the issues around it still are not determined. In fact, while we were doing Desert X, which takes place out there, we learned of a story about the tribe buying one of the commercial properties that was a signature mid-century modern property and just raising it and building their own property on it. That's the type of contentiousness that we have, where self-determination is sometimes it's about removing an architectural form from your boundaries, an architectural form that signifies a land run, that signifies crazy consumption, and that signifies a worldview that alters the landscape forever. And we imagine ourselves truck hunting. Anyone here hunt? I don't know, probably not. It's art, but we hunt.
We're in New York.
We imagine ourselves truck hunting. A lot of people think like hunting is this sacred thing and whatever, but I'll tell you what, I think more Indians truck hunt than white people do. I'll tell you that for sure. We truck hunt because we need the meat. It's not a trophy. It's about survival. So it's about sharing, and it's about practicing our culture in other ways. But we imagined truck hunting through Palm Springs on the res there, on Agua Caliente land, and seeing one of these houses under construction and getting out our skill saws and cutting off the rooftop, the truss, because that's a signature truss design, and putting that on our truck, driving it, and then displaying it as a taxidermy. So that's our conceptual like riff and humor and things like that. But really we wanted to hack at mid-century modernism. It's such a white fantasy. You know, I can't think of another architectural form that inspires white smiles as much as mid-century modern. Like, it's like one of those spaces where white people can just feel at home in their skin, you know? So that's what we wanted to get that tension and have it float in a gallery space.
I think we're also in many ways provoked by what has happened with mid-century modern architecture, particularly in Palm Springs. It's not these are not referred to as homes anymore. They're now referred to as pieces. And so we're looking at multi-million-dollar fetishization, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fetishizing homes as works of art. And so people collect them, and they're second homes, and they're venerated, and they're seen as one of the greatest things that could have happened in this golden atomic age era of America. But this is a virus, that spread, and now this virus has the land is suffering from this great infection, in particular particularly in desert climates like Palm Springs, Phoenix, metropolitan area. We're looking at massive, severe drought and then massive overdrying of the reservoirs. And so it's interesting that this happens at a time of the atomic bomb, because it's really in a lot of ways a metaphor of the atomic bomb and signaling enormous catastrophe now at our doorstep. So we had to tell this story. We had to go in there and hack into this architecture and begin to reimagine the narratives that are associated with it.
And just to give you an example of the reality, and this will probably lead into the next slide maybe, but I was born and raised in Bakersfield, California, and the valley floor, the great San Joaquin Valley floor, it's a massive valley. It's sinking in some places at a foot a year because of the water table. The water has been extracted from the table, not recharged into the aquifers. So you have a massive sinking. Okay, I thought that was bad. I moved to Phoenix. Same thing is happening in Phoenix. It's sinking at a very similar clip. It seemed like wherever I go, the floor, everything's sinking, and you can't undo these things, Just like the tower, the idea is it's a built thing. We can engineer it. Well, you can't because it's built on infill mud from the bay. There's no bedrock there. There's no stabilizing agent. Plus, you're one of the most dangerous locations in all of California in terms of all the active faults that are around there. That's the kind of intelligence that the Judeo-Christian Western scientific worldview brings to its development strategies. The underlining thing is, this is temporary. We're moving on to a greater place. So there's this one disaster after another disaster, after another disaster, after another disaster. So it's kind of depressing. So we have to make it funny at least. So, that's a taxidermy. We harvested it, we poached it.
I think the conversation about water does lead to the next slide, another commission that I wanted to ask you all about. Going to water, right? It's, again, sort of repurposed, you've repurposed images, found images in a sense, right? I'd love to hear you talk about this work, and I specifically want to note the role of the soundtrack, just to invite you to speak a little bit about sound.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about the policy in Owens Lake, and I can talk about, the score and the composition we put together.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk, because I know
it.
you guys have a background in experimental music as
Yeah.
well, and so I wanted to, I hope there was an opportunity to talk about sound.
Sure.
Yeah, there's,
Sure,
the thing about this, just real quick, everybody's seen Chinatown, the movie with Jack Nicholson? It was about Owens Lake. Owens Lake is a drainage lake on the eastern side of the Sierras. We're talking about something that stretches about 100 miles long. At least it did at one time. And about 40 miles wide. And it was one of the most environmentally significant areas in California for the riparian population. It was a place of migrating birds. It's also a great meeting place for Indian people. It's all Paiutes in the Great Basin. This is part of the Great Basin. And there's a lot of Bishop Paiute, Lone Pine, Paiute, and so forth, Big Pine, Paiute. They all would meet there, and all the bands. But the water that drove them to meet there has been illegally taken by the city of Los Angeles, the Department of Water and Power. And it's the only place I know of in the United States where you have a place out, like a governmental entity like LA Water and Power, that is exercising its jurisdiction outside of its county, outside of its city. Because you'll go to Owens Lake, which is very close to Mammoth Mountain. Anyone ever ski Mammoth Mountain? You'll drive right by that, and you'll drive by where it's dry. And you'll see it on the road. But long story short, that water's been forever, it's gone. They drained that way back in the 20s. And what you have now is another environmental disaster where you have the dirt, the soil dried up from that used to be covered by water, has all the poisons of agriculture and so forth. So now that when it blows in the air, it's carcinogenic. And this is a place of high winds, and the water is not keeping the dust from going. So what you have is some of the highest rates of cancer in the United States in that area. And it's not just happening there, it's also happening to the Great Salt Lake. Same situation now is happening in the Salt Lake City area in Utah. So they're actually using this as a case study to study. So they have multiple governments, county, state, federal, tribal, all working together to monitor the wind and to try to find a generative way to mitigate that dust. So what they do is they redirect water. LA still draws water from here, but they set up these retaining ponds and they use it for a sprinkler system. So they have a sprinkler system to help keep the dust down. That's the engineering of the 21st century. But they're trying to find ways of doing this that are efficient. Of course, we all want efficiency. And that type of study is going to be shared all over the world. This is becoming a global problem. It's also the same thing is also happening at the Salton Sea, which is in the interior desert, south of Palm Springs, east of San Diego. It's the largest interior lake in California, which was an accident. There's a breach in the Colorado River that created the Great Salt Lake, or the Great Salton Sea, so it should have never existed, but it still has the topsoil. It's still very carcinogenic, and that's what we're up against in the Southwest. So we wanted to use their environment, this intergovernmental framework for addressing this and working together, and they have over 22 cameras that survey the land every day, and they're monitoring that dust. And we wanted to, as a ready-made, bring that system into a museum. And that's what you see in that image. We have all of the videos are cycling through. There's 4 channels on the right, 4 channels on the left, and then the center channel. So all 22 of those cameras cycle through those places. And we found the windiest day of the year leading up to our show, and it was February 11th or something of 2021 is what we are presenting.
Yeah, so in the video, what you see is what amounts to a massive dust storm, brewing, and you get to witness that on surveillance. So this is like policy in action. And so what we did was, where Kate shared with you that we bring a lot of humor to our work, but in this case we really brought a lot of sorrow, like sad. We felt very, it's a really sad situation. One of the things that makes it so sad is the idea that we put land under surveillance. Like it's bad enough that we put ourselves and each other under surveillance, but now we're doing it to the land. And so we could think about that land as body metaphor starts to rear itself. And so this is kind of a grieving, a mourning and a grieving for loss, a sense of loss. And so we spent a great deal of time. This was during when there were a lot of COVID restrictions, and we found a way to set a studio up, an audio studio up, using the internet, so we could go into studio sessions together, because we thought that the way to really express this policy in action was through a soundtrack of great sorrow, great grief, while at the same time celebrating the extraordinary beauty of the land. And so this is something that is very reflective. You see a lot of, going back to your question, we're constantly looking to sound for the answers, not as much through speaking, but mostly by listening. That's what makes projects like Repellent Fence possible, is like how we function as an ear, how we function and work really hard to stretch our senses to try to understand and to try to get a sense of the world around us. And so I feel like with all the years of making sound art and doing performance and listening, that all of that experience really came to great service for us when we were putting this soundtrack together, just because of the gravity of the situation. And it was hard. I mean, we spent a lot of time on the phone and a lot of time in these studio sessions just tearing our hair out, trying to find the right, resonance. Like, how do you make a sound that creates a kind of resonance that expresses the deep, deep sorrow and mourning and grieving and catastrophe of this situation?
It also captures the beauty
and the
and the power of the area. It's one of the most beautiful places in all of California, because you have Mount Whitney and all the 14,000-foot peaks on one side, and then you have, I forget the name of the mountain range, on the Nevada side. The valley divides California and Nevada, and on that Nevada side, it's all 12,000-foot peaks. So it's like 14,000-foot peaks, 12,000-foot peaks. It's just absolutely gorgeous, and all we can do is imagine what it once was.
Yeah.
And so it was that longing for that beauty that it was dead before we were born.
Yeah.
Like, this was long before we were born, but it's just that idea of beauty that we're seeking.
Yeah. And I think that comedy, because there's still comedy in it, and where the comedy comes in is that this is a 16-channel sound installation. We use all the techniques of cinema. We thought a lot about Hollywood filmmaking, the Hollywood discourse that is implicated in this loss, and having created this loss. But we studied Phil Spector's wall of sound, and so when you come into this space, you have this truly very highly crafted experience of sort of cinematic experience of sound and moving image.
Was it 18 channels
It's
of
like,
sound?
yeah.
I think there is like a dark humor, right? And the soundtrack is very like elegiac. I encourage everyone to have a look on the website. And certainly a lot could be said about the critical renovation here of like the American landscape tradition, right? To think of like 19th century vistas or whatever,
Absolutely.
the bounty of this place. But I received the signal concerning rapping.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, awesome.
And so we will maybe...
We don't have it.
It's on our website, postcommodity.com, the sound file for that. You
Right.
can check out a sample, I think.
Yeah, it's called Going to Water.
Going to Water.
Going to water.
Yeah.
I did want to, there was one more project. Okay, I don't know if you guys wanted to talk just a little bit about Cosmovisión to give like a
Oh,
preview.
yeah.
I know I have some like Latin American fellow art historians who may be
Alright.
interested, but also I know you guys are moving towards exploring this kind of hemispheric,
Yeah.
moving your project into a more hemispheric scope.
One of the exigencies for this piece, for Cosmovisión, which translates roughly into worldview, is that a lot of the conversation around diversity has been focused on race, and not enough about worldview. As Indian people, we're not racial people. We don't identify as a race. We identify as members of a sovereign nation. We're citizens, right? We're not a race of people. We're citizens of nations. And what non-Indian people, they get confused because they want to racialize, like BIPOC, right? I don't appreciate BIPOC because it racializes us as indigenous people. And it's very difficult to have a conversation when people are damn set on racializing you, and because they're always disappointed. Indians are never enough of anything for them to satisfy them. So if we focus on worldview, maybe that's something a little bit more substantial. Because that's what our cultures are about. They're defined by worldview. And so getting to that primacy of who we are, where we came from, the land that is beneath our feet, all of these things, if we want to talk about meaning making as people having intercultural, interracial conversations, we can't do it talking purely about race.
Yes.
We have to talk about worldview because that's where meaning is made. Meaning is not made by anyone's color of skin. Meaning is made by our history, our legacy. You know, those are practiced since time immemorial. So all you people wanting to racialize Indian people, stop. Just stop it. You know, take us out of BIPOC. We don't belong in that. You know, you all, the people of BIPOC they're colonizers. They're not from the hemisphere. So to think about them as us, as being one and the same, BIPOC doesn't help. What helps is if we just sit together and listen and talk and enjoy each other's nuanced worldview and appreciate and honor how that worldview came into being and appreciate that these people, us, them, all of us, are represented by that. And let's engage at that level of worldview. I can't tell you how hard it is to be at an institution where they're doing the DEI stuff, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion stuff, and it's only focusing on race. It doesn't get into any meaningful discourse. Only it gets into us against them. That's the only way we can talk about race is us against them. It signifies that. But if we could talk about worldview, we could get on a deeper level of meaning. So Cosmovision is, as an idea and as an ideal, is about bringing people together to make music, to listen and to make music together that is focused on listening across worldview.
Yes.
Making meaning across worldview.
So, you know, to extend a little bit about what you're saying, I think what the race discourse does is it operates under the assumption that meaning is in our minds, that meaning is embodied by the individual. And the work that we're operating under, and you find this also in social linguistics, is that meaning is a consensual and a contested activity between people, and that meaning circulates through and among us as we either argue with one another or try to collaborate with one another in order to come to some ideas, some general ideas of what we believe to be good and beautiful. And so we're looking to try a new strategy with this work. And so this work is going to be a hemispherical work. We hope will be, our plans for this work is that it will result in indigenous-led dialogical conversations that help us maybe better understand a little bit more about what it means to be American, and not in the US, but American in our hemisphere at this point in time in the 21st century.
And it builds on the work that Juan Downey was doing, his video work. He was trying to capture, what does indigeneity mean in the Americas? You know, he had a vision for going from one tip of the Americas to the other on that type of project. And that's a major inspiration for this project, is to try to contribute to the wonderful work that Juan Downey did before he passed away at such a young age, you know. But that's really driving it, is just to want to know our shared understanding. And so it's an instrument that 4 people play simultaneously. They play with samples that they take from field recordings of their relationship to place. So it's looking at the intricacies of place through the construct of iconographies. And those iconographies will be what they're playing. So each player is going to be performing their own iconographies. Everybody's from the same place. So we'll be able to listen to a very nuanced relationship of individual to place, and when we're working in tribal communities, of a tribal community to place, you know, in ways that language doesn't get in the way of, you know, being, listening, you know, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, everyone is, I'm sure, I mean, I'm excited to see how this project develops and the sites that you all travel to. Maybe we have some questions about that or other things presented. The floor is open. The microphone is in the center of the ballroom.
I'm not sure if you actually had the opportunity to talk about it particularly, but considering that you were talking about some of the work that you did in California, what was your experience with Desert X in particular? I have sort of a personal interest in it because I'm from that area, and those histories are deeply problematic in that region. So I would love to hear what happened in particular with your work with Desert X and working with among the community stakeholders out there.
Desert X is, well, it's you know, it's a young thing. It's a lot of learning to do and a lot of growing and all that. And they have their own challenges in and of themselves, like any arts institution does. They've brought a lot of great artists into that area, and there's been so much wonderful work produced. I think the stewards of mid-century modern history is what your Modern Week and all of those, that whole crew. We did a sound piece where we interviewed them all, and then we hired actors just to restate that interview as a pedagogical feedback model from one generation to the next. It was like grandmother speaking to grandchild, you know, and because a lot of the people said taste skips a generation. So we wanted to have that, okay, taste skips a generation, that's in our notes, so our piece is gonna reflect that. So the actors actually, you know, re-spoke our recorded interviews. So we have, I mean, that piece that we did at Desert X, those are the gatekeepers of mid-century modern. We met them all, and we went to their Modernism Week, and we filmed there and hung out with them. You know, they probably felt like there's a little bit of a bait and switch with that. We also, that's probably the first piece that we did where we abandoned the 4 R's of relationships, respect, responsibility and reciprocity. Like, we said, you know, the idea was we're going to imitate like 18th century ethnography. And that's what we brought to that project, was an 18th century model of ethnography. I studied at the University of Oklahoma and got to learn all about that stuff when I was there. So we just applied those research methods to our conversations, to where the subjects were empty forms. They had no soul. We don't care about that, you know, what their responsibility or what their lives are about, their dreams, their hopes, their expectations, who they love, all that. We divorced ourselves from that relationship. It was really hard, and it felt dirty. But the piece is glorious. It was a really glorious sound piece. And one of the things we asked them, like, what are your anxieties? And they said Mexicans. They said Indians. They said wind and earthquakes. And
That's it.
yeah, develop.
No, it was really wind and,
Yeah,
and
wind.
earthquakes.
And Mexicans and Indians. That's what they said to us while they're being recorded, talking to. So, it was a beautiful piece in that regard because it got all those things on the record, and it informed how, the field recordings we did. We recorded a fault, the San Andreas Fault goes there. It recorded the fault. We recorded the windmills. We had a radio station, a Hispanic radio station playing in that. And then we also had the voices of the actors mixed in with the anxieties. And so it was taking place in a house that was being revitalized, remodeled to be the Wave Home, which is a very historically significant architectural piece. It was wonderful because it was there for a month and it was a part of the construction site. So the construction site's a performance. The organization of tools and materials is part of that performance. The transformation of the place from shell to finished product was part of the performance. So I'll have to say, like, Desert X, the curators we worked with, Matthew Shum and Amanda Hunt, those are two amazing people, and they had our backs, and they got everything to work so that we could be there in that, poking with a stick, in their most sacred place. And it was probably the most punk rock thing that we've ever done as Postcommodity.
We I don't think could have succeeded without the curators, Amanda Hunt and Matthew Shum, for what I feel like is embedded and inferred in your question, because Desert X as a greater project, once you start to get into the inner sanctum and you get really close to the center of power, you start to realize it's a vanity project. And that vanity project is trying to reflect New York in the desert. And it, started by someone who is a New Yorker and retired and started to try to reimagine Palm Springs in the image of all of the amenities and cultural experiences that she was used to enjoying in New York. And so when you have that kind of a foundation laid for a larger house, it requires for us, it required that we had real allies, within the system, because there would be so many things working against us in that environment politically and economically, because our discourse is essentially we're analyzing their discourse to build a discourse, to show a story behind the story, and to provide counter narrative that could potentially impact the value of their work.
It is about value, economic value. And that's a whole part of Modern Week, is to ramp up the value of those homes.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah.
That's the power of sound, though. The power of sound is you can't, it's invisible. You can't, your ears are always open, right? And when an institution is trying to operationalize you as an artist, they can't operationalize something they can't see. And so we did the same type of thing in Documenta. Documenta was, when we were in Documenta, it was horrible. Documenta 14 or whatever. Just trying to operationalize the artists into disaster tourism. And so that's why we worked with sound there. We had no site presence. We used the land as a mediator and the ruins as a mediator, and then we have sound. And then in Castle, we just had pink noise playing at an entry place out of hyperdirectional speakers. We just didn't, it was so gnarly that's the only way we felt like we could be there without pulling out of the exhibition. Because don't mistake it, we were there for our CV. We weren't there for Germany or any other reason. It was just the CV. Because that place doesn't facilitate any dialogue among the artists or anything. The party celebrating the opening is in the train station that was managing the logistics of taking Jews to concentration camps. I mean, it's a brutal, Documenta is on brutal turf. It is a brutal history, and sound helps deal with brutality. And I think that's the great thing why we go back to hyperdirectional sound, we go back to the LRAD, is because sonic weapons work. They work. At the end of the day, they're like, God created them for a reason. And it's not scaring crowds. It's being everywhere and nowhere at once. That's why they're created.
I think there's one more question, and then maybe we'll wrap up. I know we're already pushing it.
Thank you so Test, hello?
Okay, I can just project. I was really fascinated by a lot of your discussion around fantasy and modularity and kind of these myths at mid-century that were created around like the Salton Sea, which was a resort town and became this hellscape, right? Or the fantasies of the vistas that have dried up around Mammoth. And a lot of what your work seems to get to, or makes me think of at least, is this kind of fantasy that's also a hellscape. And so I was wondering what other spaces you've been wanting to think about or working about that you have in a separate file of kind of projects to do, or are there other spaces you're curious about?
I think we're really drawn to where we call home. Like Cristobal's drawn to New Mexico. I'm drawn to California. He lives in Phoenix. I lived there for 10 years, so we're both drawn to that as like neutral turf. And if you take those three states together, you have more endangered species of animals, and you have more endangered ecologies than anywhere else in the United States. So it's enough. It's a lot to work from. But if there are any curators out there, we work on commissions only, and we would be happy to think through a place that you might be interested in. I'm kind of joking, but yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of disaster spots in the United States.
The same time that he's joking, there's always truth to humor. There's always a certain degree of truth to humor, and that's something that we oftentimes find ourselves, more often than not, trying to situate ourselves as guests wherever we're invited to do commissions, and we try to make work that's meaningful to the people or the citizenry by which we've been invited to be a part of. And so that happens over and over and over again. If you go and you look at our catalog of work, you'll find us always trying to leverage resources and expertise as a catalyst, as a way so that people could use what we bring to the table to tell stories, so that we could connect those stories of cultural self-determination with publics everywhere we go. And we did that in Greece as well. And that was really hard to do, because there are very complex narratives of colonization between Germany and Greece, and there was an interest in leveraging our narratives of colonization, in search of meaning and unpacking issues in Europe, and I struggle to speak about this because when we proposed a work for Aristotle's Lyceum, and on the record, the Greek Archaeological Authority basically said it was unanimously voted against, and they said, well, what do Indians know about Aristotle anyway? So, that's the place where we have to work from.
And that went out over the press in Europe, like it
Yeah.
was in all the major city papers. Sorry.
So, but we still, we still have to find the generosity to still be respectful guests and try to learn and try to understand, and that's the work that we did. And in the end, they went from a unanimous no to a unanimous absolutely, you've got it. They let us point weapons at it. And so it's I mean, yeah, Cade's joking at the same time. He's also telling the truth. We do honestly try to listen to what's going on in a place. It goes back to the sovereignty of context with Roberto Bedoya, what Cade was sharing earlier at the start of the talk. We really want to respect that.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you. Thank you
And
both
thank you all.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you. Thank you, Elise.
And yeah, thanks for moving up too when the system crashed. Really appreciate that.